Stop scrolling. Are you concerned with the difference in platform between Trump and Biden when it comes to the plan for Black America? If so, this video is for you. For general context, both Trump and Biden have released their plans to lift up Black communities in the U.S. The difference is Trump's Platinum plan has 2 pages. Biden's Lift Every Voice plan has 48 pages. But let's go more into context, baby. Specifically, when it comes to healthcare, Trump claims that he wants to eliminate long-standing healthcare disparities while simultaneously fighting to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Here's why that's important. If the ACA, also known as the Affordable Care Act, were to be repealed, Black communities would be impacted at a greater degree than white communities, leaving 20% of Black people uninsured. Biden is calling for a bill to be passed to create a task force that would directly address the racial disparities within the healthcare. Biden plans to increase ACA subsidies and increase federal funding into Medicaid. When you casting your vote, think about healthcare. I'm not trying to endorse nobody. I'm just trying to give y'all some information, man. When it comes to the affordable housing, here's how Trump and Biden differ, especially when it comes to the plan for Black America. Trump's plan includes a statement on how he plans to champion federal policy reform to advance home ownership initiatives, but does not include details on how he plans to do so. And Biden has a plan to address the growing disparity in home ownership between Black and brown communities. Here's how it goes. He plans to invest $640 billion into affordable and safe housing. He also plans to enact policy that fights against the racial bias that leads to homes in Black and POC communities to be valued lower. And before I go into more detail about how these two presidential candidates differ on different platforms, especially when it comes to their plan for Black America, I want to remind y'all that y'all are going to be voting on more than the president of the United States, especially when you start looking down that ballot. You're going to be voting on people who run your school, who run your county jail, and all things like that. When it comes to the 2020 election, are you curious in how Trump and Biden differs on systemic racism? Let's talk about it. Although Trump recognizes that systemic racism exists and that Joe Biden's 1994 crime bill is a great instance of systemic racism, Trump's Platinum plan does not include any direct reference or plan to address systemic or institutional racism against Black people or people of color. However, we know that Biden addresses systemic racism in his plan and includes steps to combat it across different areas. His plan outlines the ways to address and implement specific policies to healthcare, climate change, and education, among others, that will tackle the issue of systemic racism in the U.S. to root it out of our systems. Allegedly, because you know how that be, allegedly. Now, before I get into the next issue on how these two candidates differ, I want to remind y'all that emotional intelligence is key. Before you jump on one of these media-constructed emotional roller coasters, make sure you protecting your peace, because you will run yourself crazy if you jump on that emotional roller coaster and the ups and downs and the ups and downs. Protect your peace. When it comes to the 2020 election, are you curious in how Trump and Biden differs on systemic racism? Let's talk about it. Although Trump recognizes that systemic racism exists and that Joe Biden's 1994 crime bill is a great instance of systemic racism, Trump's Platinum plan does not include any direct reference or plan to address systemic or institutional racism against Black people or people of color. However, we know that Biden addresses systemic racism in his plan and includes steps to combat it across different areas. His plan outlines the ways to address and implement specific policies to healthcare, climate change, and education, among others, that will tackle the issue of systemic racism in the U.S. to root it out of our systems. Allegedly, because you know how that be, allegedly. Now, before I get into the next issue on how these two candidates differ, I want to remind y'all that emotional intelligence is key. Before you jump on one of these media-constructed emotional roller coasters, make sure you protecting your peace, because you will run yourself crazy if you jump on that emotional roller coaster and the ups and downs and the ups and downs. Protect your peace. How does Trump and Biden differ on education? As a professor and a teacher, I think that this topic of education is very important because, education is elevation, baby. You know that Trump's plan includes increasing the child care tax credits to provide greater access to preschool, as well on higher education. He pledged to protect the vital role of HBCUs. What we know is that in 2019, that Trump increased the federal funding for HBCUs by 13%. In comparison, Biden has released detailed plans to address racial inequality across the entire scope of child's education, including things like this. He wants to provide a universal pre-K system for 3 and 4-year-olds. He also wants to eliminate the funding gap in white and non-white school districts to improve teacher diversity. He wants to make university tuition free at public HBCUs for households earning less than $125,000 a year. And lastly, but definitely not least, he wants to forgive undergraduate-related federal debt from public colleges for debt holders earning less than $125,000 a year. Education is elevation. So how does Joe Biden and Trump differ when it comes to criminal justice? Let's get into it. Trump's plan includes announcing the National Clemency Act, but let's do a little fact checking right here. He's granted just barely over one clemency petition a month on average during his presidency, while his predecessor averaged about 18 a month. Think about that right there. But think about this also. Installing the most responsive, professional, accountable models of policing, including diversity training and accreditation standards. As the Black Lives Matter movement gained traction, people demanded action. Trump took little to real action. Here's how Biden differs. Biden's plan includes reforming the justice system by rooting out the racial, gender, and income-based disparities in the system. He's also calling for the passage of the Congress Bobby Scott's Safe Justice Act to implement justice reform from both the front and back ends of the system. He also plans to invest more in public defender offices. As well as his controversial support of the 1994 Crime Bill, Biden has called his supporting of this a big mistake and pledged to try to correct this massive. So when it comes to the LGBTQ plus community, especially the people of color, let's see how Joe Biden and Donald Trump differ on this whole issue. You know that Trump doesn't make any statements that addresses BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color members of the LGBTQ plus community. But listen, and Biden explicitly states that he plans to combat the epidemic against transgender women of color to prioritize the prosecution of these murders. He also plans to work toward the passage of the Equality Act. That's an act that presents discrimination on the basis of race, gender, identity, sexual orientation, in public, private spaces, or accommodations. Biden is supporting the passage of the LGBTQ Essential Date Act that will help collect critical data about anti-trans violence to understand how this factor drives it. Finally, in conclusion, although Trump claims to be the best president for Black Americans since Abraham Lincoln, literally, we know that when it comes to his platform for Black America, they lack detail, they lack strategy for us to improve our realities.